There's a brass key on my desk right now that almost cost me the only home that ever felt real. My name is Andrew Collins. I'm 34, and that key belonged to my Uncle Frank, a man who spent 40 summers teaching me how to read weather off a mountain ridge before I ever learned how to read a balance sheet. The lodge that key opens sits 2 hours outside Denver, Colorado, wedged into a stand of pine trees above a lake so still in the early morning that it looks like glass someone forgot to break. I spent every June of my childhood there, barefoot on that porch, watching Frank pour 2 mugs of coffee even when it was just the two of us, because he said a house should always be ready for one more person. He never explained what that meant. I understood it 3 months ago, sitting in an attorney's office in a suit that suddenly felt too tight, listening to a stranger read my uncle's final condition out loud. Frank hadn't simply left me the lodge. He'd left me a puzzle disguised as an inheritance. According to the will, I had exactly 1 day, 24 hours from that meeting, to become legally married, or the entire property would pass to my cousin Victor, a man who had already quietly listed 2 similar mountain properties for sale that same year and clearly saw Frank's lodge as inventory rather than home. I laughed out loud in that office, a short, disbelieving sound, because it felt like Frank was reaching out from wherever he was and forcing me to actually live the lesson he'd spent decades trying to teach me, instead of just hearing it. I left that meeting with 23 hours and no plan. I called people I hadn't spoken to in years. I opened apps I'd deleted after my last relationship ended badly. Nothing worked, and by early evening, I was slouched in a cafe booth 2 blocks from my office, phone against my ear, describing the entire absurd situation to my business partner, in a voice loud enough that I didn't notice the woman at the next table until she laughed, quietly, at exactly the wrong moment for me and exactly the right moment for this story. Her name was Lily Harper, a schoolteacher grading a stack of essays with a red pen she gripped like a weapon, and when I turned to apologize, she asked if I was serious or just having the worst day of my life out loud in public. I told her everything: the lodge, the will, the countdown clock now sitting somewhere under 20 hours. She didn't leave. She didn't laugh again either, not really. She just kept asking questions, sharp ones, the kind a good teacher asks when she already suspects the real answer is more complicated than the surface one. Somewhere around hour 2, after the cafe staff had started flipping chairs onto tables around us, I said the sentence that changed everything. "I need a wife by tomorrow." Lily went quiet. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of notebook paper, its creases soft from being opened and closed more than once, and slid it toward me. "I'll marry you," she said, "but promise me this," and pointed at the paper like it was the only part of the conversation that actually mattered. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting some kind of financial protection clause. Instead, I found 5 handwritten conditions that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of man she needed me to actually be. Honesty, even when it cost me something. Respect, the kind that survives long after the excitement fades. Patience, especially on the hardest days. Real presence, not just a signature on a marriage license. And a promise to make time for people who needed help, no matter how full my calendar got. I signed it in that booth at close to midnight, 18 hours before the deadline, my hand steadier than I expected given how little of this made sense. What I didn't know yet was that this 5-line promise was going to matter far more than the will itself, and it was going to unearth a piece of my uncle's history I'd never once heard. We married the next morning in a rushed courthouse ceremony, 40 minutes before the deadline expired, 2 strangers reciting vows to a clerk who clearly wasn't sure whether to smile or call security. Victor's claim to the lodge evaporated the moment that certificate was signed, and I assumed the hardest part was finally over. It wasn't. Weeks later, while going through Frank's old ledgers with Lily at the kitchen table, trying to sort out property taxes, she went suddenly, completely silent, staring at a name written in the corner of a receipt from decades earlier. It was her mother's maiden name. Frank, it turned out, had quietly covered a broke 17-year-old girl's rent for 6 months back when he still ran the town hardware store, never mentioning it to anyone, including that girl's own daughter sitting across from me now with tears in her eyes. "He always left an empty mug on that porch," I told her, my voice catching. I think he was still waiting to thank her properly. Lily sat with that for a long time, and something shifted permanently between us that afternoon. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or deadlines, and everything to do with the strange, invisible threads connecting our families long before either of us knew it. Victor, of course, wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the ledger discovery, a private investigator showed up at Lily's school, flashing a business card at the front office and asking questions about her family history, clearly hoping to dig up something he could twist into evidence that our marriage, and by extension Frank's old kindness toward her mother, was somehow connected, staged, or fraudulent. The school secretary called Lily out of a lesson to deal with it, and when she told me that evening, hands still shaking slightly as she set her keys down on the counter, I felt something close to rage for the first time since this whole ordeal began. I drove to Victor's office the next morning without calling ahead. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I simply laid Frank's old ledger on his desk, the one with Lily's mother's name written in his own uncle's handwriting decades before either of us existed to Victor as anything more than an inconvenience, and told him that if his investigator came near her school again, I'd make sure every reporter in Denver knew exactly what kind of man contests a grieving family's inheritance while accusing a school teacher of fraud. Victor went quiet in a way I'd never seen from him before, and the investigator never resurfaced. Lily never fully relaxed about it, not completely, but something in the way she looked at me changed after that morning, like she'd finally stopped waiting to see whether I'd choose comfort over her when it actually cost me something. From that point on, the arrangement stopped feeling temporary. We spent the following months turning the lodge into something Frank would have recognized, hosting weekend retreats for teachers Lily knew who never got real vacations, funding a small scholarship in her mother's name, filling that porch with actual noise for the first time in years. I learned how to fix a leaking roof from a video Lily found online while I stood there holding a flashlight and feeling more useful than I had in a decade of boardrooms. She learned that I wasn't nearly as impossible as my reputation at the office apparently suggested. We laughed constantly, argued occasionally, and neither of us mentioned the fact that legally, the marriage no longer needed to exist for either of us to keep what mattered. By early autumn, we hosted the first Frank Collins Memorial Weekend at the lodge, and I still remember standing on that same porch watching cars roll up the gravel drive, string lights looped between the pines, the smell of wood smoke and cider mixing with pine sap in a way that instantly pulled me back to being 9 years old. Lily had invited a dozen teachers from her school, worn out and grateful for a weekend that wasn't graded or scheduled, along with 3 families her mother had stayed close with since Frank's quiet act of kindness decades earlier. I watched Lily move through the crowd, laughing, refilling mugs, kneeling down to talk to a shy kid clutching a fishing rod twice his size near the dock, and I understood watching her that Frank hadn't just handed me a building on a mountain, he'd handed me a blueprint for what that building was actually supposed to be used for. That night, after the last car pulled away and the fire had burned down to orange coals, Lily sat beside me on the porch steps, exhausted in the particular way that only comes from a day spent doing something that matters, and rested her head on my shoulder without either of us saying anything for a long while. I remember thinking, right there, that if this arrangement ever legally ended, I had absolutely no idea how I was supposed to go back to a life that didn't include evenings like that one. Then came the afternoon Lily started packing. She told me, in the calm, careful voice she probably used on nervous students, that since the will's requirement had been satisfied months earlier and neither of us had ever promised forever, she thought it was fair to let me return to my real life before this got harder to walk away from than it already was. I stood in the doorway holding that brass key, the one that now lived permanently in my pocket, and felt something in my chest crack wide open. I asked her to give me exactly 1 hour. I drove her back up to the lodge, up to that same porch, past the same lake turning gold in the late afternoon light, and I set 2 mugs of coffee down on the railing exactly the way Frank used to, one for each of us, no one left waiting this time. I told her the truth. I told her I'd kept 4 of her 5 promises without much effort, because loving her had made them easy, and I was terrified of breaking the 5th one, the unspoken one neither of us had written down, the promise to never let her walk out that door for good. I almost lost this lodge because I didn't have a wife, I said, my voice barely holding steady. Now I realize I almost lost you because I was too scared to say I didn't want this to be temporary. Lily looked at the key still in my hand, then up at my face and finally let herself cry the way I think she'd been holding back for weeks. I only wrote that list because I was terrified of being left again, she whispered. I never expected the man who needed a wife by tomorrow to become the one I couldn't picture any tomorrow without. That brass key still sits on my desk most days, a reminder that Frank's strange, impossible deadline wasn't really about the lodge at all. It was about making sure I didn't spend my whole life keeping an empty mug on the porch, waiting for someone I was too afraid to actually let in. I wrote that list because I was terrified of being left again, she whispered. I never expected the man who needed a wife by tomorrow to become the one I couldn't picture any tomorrow without. That brass key still sits on my desk most days, a reminder that Frank's strange, impossible deadline wasn't really about the lodge at all. It was about making sure I didn't spend my whole life keeping an empty mug on the porch, waiting for someone I was too afraid to actually let in. I wrote that list because I was terrified of being left again, she whispered. I never expected the man who needed a wife by tomorrow to become the one I couldn't picture any tomorrow without. That brass key still sits